everyone. Are all of you able to view my live feed as well as hear my voice clearly? Am I clearly audible to all of you? Hello and welcome to another session which would be focused on covering different aspects of general knowledge and general awareness and current affairs related to India and a bit about the world as well. So today's topic would be focused on covering some important aspects of the Indian economy and a bit about Indian demography as well, and some important aspects of the world economy as well. And there are variables or factors in terms of ranks which are determined for India and the world. And we are going to discuss some interesting ranks for India in numerous world rankings. This often provides you a perspective on how basically India is faring vis-a-vis its counterparts in the global economy in different sectors of the economy and in different sectors of the larger social life. The purpose of this particular session is to provide you a glimpse of how do we measure different aspects of performance of a country's economy and how that economy matters, or to provide you some idea in terms of interesting facts and figures of how those different values of the different aspects of the economy actually relate to the day-to-day life standards of the people. We are not going to go into any details here, largely because of the fact that that would require actually studying different concepts in economics and a bit of finance as well, which is not the purpose of these sessions here, because if I try to delve a little bit into some aspects of macroeconomics and some aspects of finance, I'm first of all not an expert on finance, so that would require some more sessions, and that is not the purpose of these all these online virtual sessions either. So we are going to cover very basics, and from those basics, and when we look at different values of different countries and compare them to India's, we are going to realize where India stands and how should I put it, what India's overall situation is when it comes to the world economy. So let us begin. I am going to share once again my screen with you, where there is a document open, and so if perhaps all of you are able to view this particular screen, if you could just write in the chat that all of you are able to okay, yes, so I can see that okay, are others also able to clearly view this screen and this particular document? Okay, so India and world economy, that is the topic for today. And first we cover some basic aspects about the Indian economy, and then we go and cover some other rankings and other aspects related to India in terms of different areas of our public life, some aspects of demography as well. And then we move on to do a bit of comparison with the world economy. So Indian economy. Now, the very first aspect is that in order to calculate anything about any economy, we need to clearly define a timeline as to what is the timeline. And usually a timeline is always an year. So for India, the financial year, and we call it the financial year, not the economic year, because of the fact that all the different for-profit organizations, that means all the different firms and companies, as well as all the government departments, government organizations, and state as well as the central government, they all calculate and audit and present their accounts in that time frame, and that has been a practice that has been going on for decades and decades. So the Indian financial year runs from April 1 of any particular calendar year till March 31 of the next year. So currently financial year 2021 is going on, which will end on the March 31, 2021, while the last financial year ended on March 31, 2020. And often in short form, what we write is that FY20 would mean the financial year that ended on March 31, 2020. So the year in which any financial year's time period ends, that is the year which is written in short after FY. So FY stands for financial year and 20 stands for basically the year in which that financial year ended. So currently, the financial year that will end on March 31st, 2021 would be written in short as FY21. So in FY20, as per World Bank figures accessed in December 2020, so according to the latest World Bank figures, which were accessed in 2020, and then they were published by different media, and you can always go to the World Bank website and search for these figures yourself. India's GDP in nominal terms was US dollar $2.87 trillion. Now, what is nominal terms? Nominal terms simply mean, we're again not going to go into the technicalities of these things, but just understand in simple terms that GDP in nominal terms means that what is the present value, or let's say the average value over any particular quarter or any particular month, usually over a particular quarter or a particular 6-month period. What is the average value of the exchange rate of that particular country's currency vis-a-vis the United States dollar? Now, I'm sure all of you are already aware, and if not, let me tell you that the United States dollar remains the global reserve currency. Whenever there is any problem or any scenario or any difficult financial situation for any country, there is the global financial system was developed in a manner post World War II in the late 1940s, and it has evolved ever since, such that the United States dollar, largely because the United States is the world's militarily, technologically most advanced country, and it also is economically the most developed country with the most advanced and developed financial markets and markets for other securities. That's why the United States currency is the world's strongest currency, and almost every country in the world tries to hold as much reserves of the US dollar as possible in order to protect themselves, or rather cushion themselves against any difficult financial or economic circumstances. So that is also the reason why any country's governments or their own organizations, as well as all international organizations like the World Bank, the IMF, the Asian Development Bank, the World Trade Organization, even the United Nations, and all these different global organizations also measure almost every aspect of world society or world economy, or any kind of financial or economic statistic is given in terms of units of US dollars. So India's GDP nominal terms was US dollar 2.87 trillion. Now, this basically means that for financial year 2020, now again, there can always be some disparity here, that sometimes what the World Bank does is that they publish figures for calendar years. And this is something that is not clear, because the World Bank itself takes data from nowhere else but the Indian government only, because the World Bank does not have any other data or figures of their own that they directly collect from Indian economy. I mean, it's not possible for World Bank to have the kind of resources to actually conduct in-depth surveys across the Indian economy and collect their independent figures. So whatever World Bank publishes is based on the economic statistics that are published by the Indian government. And then they have their own expert analysis based on the exchange rates that are existing at different points of time. So as per the World Bank figures that were available in December 2020, that is just 1 month ago or so, in financial year 2020, which ended on March 31st, 2020, India's GDP was US dollar 2.87 trillion. That is taking an average of the exchange rate of the Indian rupee vis-a-vis the US dollar, and then converting India's total GDP in terms of rupees to that, multiplying it with that value of the US dollar in Indian rupees. So we arrived at this figure of US dollar 2.87 trillion. Again, I'm repeating, in nominal terms simply means that what was the latest, you can say the very recent average figure, the very recent average figure of the US dollar compared to the Indian rupee. Again, we are not taking into account here something very important, which is called inflation. Now, anyone or each one of you who has an economics background, who has studied any subjects in economics, would know what inflation basically means. So if we take into account inflation, then perhaps these figures would change to some extent. But here nominal term simply means the current value. And by current value does not mean the value which was previous day. It means that maybe the last month or the last quarter, the average value of the average value of the exchange rate of the two countries that are in question. So that was the value of the, now in an earlier session, I had told you that India's nominal GDP was somewhere around US dollar 2.75 trillion. So that was actually a slightly earlier figure, which was probably for financial year 2019. And this keeps varying. This value also keeps varying because of the variation in the exchange rate of the US dollar versus the Indian rupee. So suppose if the exchange rate went from 70 rupees to 73 rupees, so automatically there will be a, and if the GDP does not change at all, that means there will be a nearly 5% change in the value of the GDP, despite the fact that the actual GDP in rupees remains the same. So these kinds of complexities constantly come into the picture. So we just have to remember some rough, as close to accurate estimates as possible, but we cannot ever have very accurate estimates. And for your purpose of preparing for your WATs and for your interviews, it is not required either. Now we come to something else, which is called purchasing power parity, PPP. What is PPP? To put it simply, purchasing power parity is an exchange rate which takes into account the average annual price of the standard basket of goods and services that are commonly consumed, standard basket of goods and services that are commonly consumed across populations everywhere in the world. So basically World Bank and IMF and United Nations and all these global organizations they follow this standard criteria called purchasing power parity, which means that, let's say, for a standard basket or a standard set of goods and services, which would include food, healthcare, housing, transportation costs, education, electricity bills, water bills, stuff like that. These are all some standard goods and services that are universally recognized and expected that everywhere and anywhere across the world, these are some standard goods and services that populations are expected to use or expected to consume. So what will be the average price per month or per year for, let's say, an average person in the US versus what will be the cost of that same set of basket of goods and services per month for an average person or an average household in India? So if we take one person, an average person in the US, we take an average person in India. If we take an average household in the US, we take an average household in India. Again, let me repeat, there you can always find a lot of research on the internet where a lot of these factors and a lot of the figures that are related to these factors are always debated. There are always some sets of experts and economists which will say that purchasing power parity is a very strong measure. There are some other sets of economists who keep publishing their own research saying that purchasing power parity can work effectively in certain areas, but cannot work effectively in certain other types of comparisons. But we do not have to go into those technicalities. What we have to remember is that purchasing power parity, at least for India's purpose, is an interesting and important figure, because that gives that provides a picture that, okay, let's say a median person, average or a median person in India, in order to enjoy or use some standard goods and services, like how much is going to be the cost of a house, or how much is going to be the rent of a house, and how much is going to be the monthly cost of transport, or monthly cost on groceries, or monthly expenditure on other household items, monthly expenditure on education, monthly expenditure on healthcare, etc., etc., compared to an average individual or a median income individual in the US, and what is their cost. And we are well aware that in the United States, the cost is higher on an average compared to India. In fact, let me share with you that according to the purchasing power parity terms, and this is something you don't, if you can remember, fair enough, you cannot remember, doesn't matter. But according to the purchasing power parity terms, because the cost of living is higher in the US, so it's nearly, I would say, 3 to 3.5 times that of India. That's why the actual value of the US dollar comes to around 22 to 23. The actual value of the US dollar, when we take into account the cost of living as well, then it is not 73 or 74, which is the nominal value, but the actual PPP value of the US dollar versus the Indian rupee comes out to around 22 to 23. So that makes basically the PPP exchange rate, PPP exchange factor, as around 3.2 to 3.3. That is, an average person in the US spends 3 times the amount that an average person, or 3.2 times the amount that an average person spends in India. But then, of course, there are other factors, because the median incomes or the average incomes that a person earns are much higher in the US, nearly 8 to 9 times higher, even 10 to 12 times higher than India. So of course, that takes care of the person's expenses. So because it is nearly 3.5 times, that is why that 3.2 to 3.3 exchange factor is multiplied with this 2.87, and we get this figure of 9.5 trillion. So if you actually multiply that 3.2, 3.3, or roughly around 3.5, you arrive at this figure of US dollar 9.5 trillion, which is the GDP of India in terms of purchasing power parity. That is US dollar 9.5 trillion. Okay, one of the participants is asking, this contrast is on the basis of sir. So could you elaborate on your question? What exactly do you mean? If from what I understand, if you mean that how come these two figures are so different, so as I explained, that according to purchasing power parity, that is in simple terms, the same set of goods and services cost 3.2 to 3.3 times in the US compared to India. So that's why this figure of 2.87 trillion India's GDP actually has to be multiplied with 3.2 to 3.3, and then we get the GDP of India in terms of purchasing power parity. Because once we arrive at PPP figures, then the cost of goods and services becomes the same on both sides, because we have multiplied with that factor 3.2 to 3.3, or sometimes it's 3.5, sometimes it's 3.1. It keeps varying because there are so many economic factors in play here. We are not going to go into the technicalities. Even if I go into the details of it, I'll also get confused. I'm not an expert in economics either. So I'm not an economist. So this is just a simple way to understand that cost of living for any standard set of goods and services is around 3 to 3.5 times, roughly around 3 to 3.2, 3.3 times in the US on an average, compared to on an average in India. So that's why India's GDP figures have to be multiplied by 3 times. So that's why this is the figure we arrive at, 9.5 trillion. That suppose if both the countries had the same currency and there were no exchange rates, the exchange rate was just one, and both the currencies had the same exchange rate, and the same kind of, cost of living, then India's GDP would have been 9.5 trillion. And of course, US GDP, as we are going to learn later on, is 21.4 trillion. So that's the actual comparison. You can say that India in total, considering cost of living comparisons as well, produces 9.5 trillion worth of GDP, whereas US produces 21.4 trillion worth of GDP. But of course, we also have to take into account that India's population is nearly 4.2 times that of the US. So you can very well imagine that per capita or per person, production of GDP is much higher. That is, the per capita GDP of the United States is still around, you can say, roughly 8 times higher than that of India's, or more than 8 times, in fact, nearly 9.5 times or something, that of India's. Anyways, we are not going to get too much confused with so many figures. We just have to remember that India's GDP in purchasing power parity terms is 9.5 trillion. Again, all this data has been picked up from the World Bank. And as I told you, as the exchange rate shifts, like let's say, for example, if 6 months or 1 year down the line, the exchange rate of the US dollar versus the Indian rupee was to come back to 65 instead of 73 right now, again, these figures are going to change. But we just have to remember whatever were the latest average figures, like the average figures for the last 6 months or the average figure for the last financial year. That's what we are concerned with here. So hence India, by it I mean India. Hence India was the world's 3rd largest economy in PPP terms and the 5th largest in nominal terms at the end of financial year 2020, or you can also say at the end of calendar year 2019. It doesn't matter much. India's financial year ends on March 31, 2020. But even if we consider the 2019 calendar year, it is the same, the ranking. So in calendar year 2019, you can say for that calendar year, January 1st, 2019 till December 31, 2019, India was basically the 3rd largest economy in PPP terms. The largest was China. The number 2 was US, as we are going to study later on as well, while India was number 3. And number 4 and number 5, which we are going to study later, are Japan and Germany, respectively. And if we take this ranking in terms of nominal terms, that is, we only take the current value of exchange rate of every other currency versus the US dollar, then of course US is number 1, China is number 2, Japan is number 3, Germany is number 4. And currently UK and France are very close to India, but they are just marginally ahead of India at number 5 and number 6. And it is estimated that by the end of this financial year, that is by the end of 2021 financial year, India will be at number 7. But there are a lot of uncertainties right now because of the pandemic situation in different countries, how it is evolving and how it is eventually going to impact the final figures of GDP for this financial year. It's all very hazy right now. There's no clarity whatsoever on that. It might still be that because UK and France are still facing major outbreaks of COVID-19, currently, it might be that India will remain 5th largest in terms of nominal. But in terms of PPP, there is absolutely no doubt. In terms of purchasing power parity, India will remain the 3rd largest economy. There is no way that any other country, despite the pandemic or no pandemic, they are not going to cross India's rank 3rd. And maybe in 10 years' time or so, perhaps 10 or 12 years' time, India might even cross, 15 years' time, India might even cross the United States to become the 2nd largest economy in terms of purchasing power parity. But that will still take around maybe 15 years or so. It depends on how India grows and it depends on how US grows. So, as I said, it is estimated to be the 6th or the 7th largest economy in nominal terms by the end of FY21. Again, because why? If economy contracts more than UK or France, it depends because how the COVID-19 situation is evolving. So now we come to a very interesting fact about the Indian economy, which is globally everywhere, economic statistics and economics is macroeconomics especially is studied in various aspects, but one of the important elements is that how the different sectors of the economy contribute to the GDP. So across the globe, there are 3 major sectors of the economy defined for the purpose of economic study, which are services, industry, and agriculture. Now, services nowadays in almost all developed countries, in fact, in all the developed countries and in almost all the developing countries as well, the services sector contributes the highest to the GDP. Now, what do we mean by services sector? Services sector basically simply means that the entire huge set of all kinds of services that individuals, organizations of all kinds consume and enjoy over the period of any financial year or over the period of any calendar year in an economy. Services range from any kinds of traveling, tourism, restaurants, hotels, banking services, all kinds of other services like transportation services, healthcare services, IT services, all these kinds of different services. There are so many different kinds of services. There are thousands and thousands of different kinds of services that are being provided on a regular basis by individuals and firms and organizations, as well as the government to other people and other organizations. So all that is included in the services sector. So you can basically very well imagine right now what I am doing is basically a service that I'm providing. So whatever value that I am adding and to you or and howsoever it is counted in the GDP, this is also a part of the services sector. This is not some manufacturing or agriculture that I'm doing. This is just a service that I'm providing. So you can very well imagine that nowadays in a modern knowledge economy, services is bound to contribute significantly to the to any country's GDP, especially if it is an advanced country or a fast developing, fast growing emerging economy. So as per FY20, again, financial year 20 GDP figures, services sector contributed 58%, 58% to the GDP, whereas industry, now the reason why I have highlighted industry, I'll explain just now why I have highlighted industry. Industry contributes 27% and agriculture contributes 17%. Agriculture contributes 17%. These are kind of rough figures, not very accurate figures. So you can say this is around 15%. This is actually somewhere around 26 to 27 basically. And this is somewhere around 16, 15 to 16, 15 to 16. And this is somewhere around 57 to 58. I took the rounded figures. That's why they were not adding up to 100%. So you all must be wondering that 58 and 27 and 17% are not exactly adding to 100%. They're a little over 100% because I rounded off the figures. If we take the actual figure somewhere in between these, it comes to around 100%. It comes to 100%. So this is the range. And in any interview or in any kind of a write-up, if you express these figures that as per these latest figures for so-and-so financial year or so-and-so estimates given by the government, it is always considered as a well-known knowledge or well-known fact. Nobody expects you to know the exact figure, but if it is close to the actual number, that's considered fine. So industry contributes 26 to 27% of the GDP and agriculture contributes 15 to 16%. Now, industry includes three major subsectors of the economy, which are manufacturing, construction, and mining. Now, manufacturing is, for especially India's case, a very, very significant sector of the Indian economy because there are so many studies. There are numerous studies over the last 80 to 100 years in global economy, which have been done by unimaginable number of economists across the globe, which clearly prove that one single technology-based manufacturing product directly as well as indirectly generates dozens of jobs. One single automobile, one single two-wheeler or one single four-wheeler being manufactured indirectly generates more than 20 jobs in the economy. If you go and search, I'm just citing a very rough figure, you can actually find the exact figures for different kinds of two-wheelers or four-wheelers, or let's say a laptop being manufactured or a mobile phone being manufactured, or let's say something like a, for example, any electrical or electronics component being manufactured or any heavy machinery being manufactured. So one single technology-based product that is manufactured inside the borders of a country, its entire design, manufacturing, repair, all of that put together contributes so many different jobs in the economy. One single service that a person is providing may or may not generate one or two extra jobs in the economy. But one single product being manufactured generates scores of jobs in the economy. That is why manufacturing, especially for a country like India, with its kind of vast population, which is now close to 1.4 billion, manufacturing is critical for the economy. And we are going to learn very soon in the later half of this session, why am I citing this figure again and again? So let's move ahead. And agriculture is 15 to 16%. Anyhow, we are all very well aware that the actual value added, although even today, nearly 41% of India's population, 42% of India's population is dependent on agriculture, and nearly 60% of India's population is dependent on overall rural economy. So there is a difference between rural economy and agriculture that I had explained in one of the previous sessions as well. So nearly 42%, 41% of India's population is dependent on agriculture for their livelihood, and around 60% are dependent on rural economy even today. So you can imagine how badly skewed India's incomes and earnings are. That is, most of the GDP that is produced by services or by manufacturing is actually produced by a handful of people. In fact, just 20 to 25% of the people produce nearly 80% of India's GDP. So you can imagine how badly skewed this figure is, and that's why we can very well see how in the last some time rural economy and agriculture have become a major point of contention, and a lot of different communities and groups have their own issues to raise, and all kinds of controversies and debates and protests and discussions and things like that are going on. So let's move on. Now, this is something that it's just to give you a better idea. We are not going to go into these details. All those people who have already studied subjects in economics, or some of you who have an economics background or who have done minors in economics, would know this very well. But for all the other people, for all the rest and everyone, we are just going to go into one figure to give you an idea of how things are calculated and what are the aspects that go into it. So GDP can be broken up into different components. And again, there can be different approaches through which these components are decided. Like there could be one approach according to which components are divided into so and so subheadings. There could be another approach according to which the components of GDP are defined so and so. But there's one standard practice under which one of the components is the private final consumption expenditure, or simply it is simply called private consumption or consumption sometimes. So what is private consumption or private final consumption expenditure? This simply means that all the products and services, or all the goods and services that are consumed by people inside the borders of a country over one financial year. Now, what do I mean by consumed? Consumed means that once these goods and services are bought, that is, once individuals buy them, then they consume them. They do not lead to any further GDP generation. They are consumed. Once they are bought, let's say food is bought for a certain amount, that food goes inside our bodies, and that's it. It's not resulting in some kind of investment which is generating further GDP. Now, of course, you can always say, if you go by biology, that if we do not get energy in our bodies, how are we going to work and how are we going to contribute to the GDP? So in that sense, yes, everything is connected. But when it comes to calculating economic statistics and computing GDP, there are certain sets of goods and services like food, buying anything like let's say, for example, a car or a toothpaste, or your medicines, or your household appliances, or you go out and travel, and you take banking services, or you take education services, or any other kind of service, transportation services, any other kind of healthcare services. All these things are something that you consume. It's not like when you are taking a healthcare service, then you are basically investing in something else which is giving further returns. Indirectly, yes, it is. But when it comes to calculating the GDP directly, no, they are not resulting in. So all this is included in the private consumption or private final consumption expenditure. And in India, it contributes around 56% of the total GDP. So India still is largely considered to be something called investment and export led economy. I'm just not going to go into any technical or number details into it, but the other components apart from private consumption are investment and net exports. That is the difference of exports and imports. So that is called the net exports, the difference of exports and imports. So investment basically means that all the money that is put into creating new assets. All of you who have studied accounts and finance would very well know what assets are and what assets and liabilities statement is, what profit and loss statement is, what this cash flow statement is. I'm sure you have studied the different kinds of financial statements, but for all the rest, I'm not going to go into these details. But basically, investment simply means that any money that is put, in very simple terms, any money that is put into creating new assets which then generate further GDP value. For example, buying a machine for a factory, or constructing a new bridge, or putting up a new railway line, or opening a new airport, or putting up a new power plant, putting up a new factory, buying new manufacturing machines for a plant, or investing in a new software, any kind of software on any kind of machine. So all these are considered basically investments, because these create assets which then again further generate GDP over the long term. So this is investment. Now, in India, even today, investment is fairly low compared to the GDP as a percentage of GDP. India's investment still remains less than 30% of the GDP, whereas for an economy like China, which is based heavily on manufacturing, that is much higher, much higher. It's around 40%, 35 to 40%. So that is where the difference comes, that China is not so much dependent on exports anymore, but it used to be dependent on exports. But in the last 10 years or 12 years or so, it has become heavily an investment-led economy, much greater than India. India is still largely a export as well as a bit of investment-led economy. Now you're going to say that private consumption is 56% of the GDP. So why are we not saying that India is an consumption-led economy? Because you are going to realize that for developed countries like US, Japan, countries of Europe, the consumption figure is sometimes 100% and even higher than 100% of the GDP. So it is close to 100% and sometimes even higher than 100% of the GDP, the consumption figures. Because now you're going to say, how is it higher than 100%? It becomes higher than 100% because sometimes people consume goods and services by taking loans. Quite often people actually consume goods and services through credit that they take, and the total amount of loans or credit that is taken by banks in the developed countries is far higher than in India. So that's why consumption figures are close to 100% or sometimes even over it in advanced countries. Those countries are called consumption-led economies. China is a majorly investment-led economy, and India is gradually moving towards an investment-led economy, but right now it is considered a mix of exports as well as investment-led economy. So we move on to the next. Now this is again a very important and interesting figure, that India's per capita income in PPP terms, that is the total income, total annual income of all individuals and organizations in India put together. If you put together all individuals and organizations in India, their total annual income. Okay, so one of the participants recently just now mentioned a very interesting fact, that in one of the TV debates, one of the economists said that India is a consumption-based economy. See, again, as I told you, there are a certain set of economists that are saying that India is a consumption-led economy, but that's not true. If you go and compare consumption figures for the entire developed world, and even the consumption figures of countries like China and some other fast emerging countries like South Korea. South Korea is still not a developed country. It is still an emerging country, but far higher than India in terms of its median incomes and per capita incomes or per capita GDP. So consumption as a percentage of GDP, private consumption as a percentage of GDP is much higher there. It's around 80% or 90% and sometimes around 100%. But definitely over 80% for all advanced countries. Definitely over 90%, 80, 85%, or even 90% for all advanced countries. So when we consider the global view, India is still largely an investment-led and to some extent an export-led economy, whereas China is overwhelmingly now an investment-led and to some extent a consumption-led economy. So China has already made that transition from investment-led to a somewhat consumption-led economy. And in another 10 years time or so, China is also going to become an a consumption-led economy. But India will still take, perhaps, if things go all right, India will take another 20 to 22 years, or roughly around 20 years to become a full-fledged consumption-led economy where private consumption as a percentage of GDP is somewhere above 80%. Okay. So you will find, see, as you are very well aware, and I'm sure you all are mature enough and you have that ability to logically reason, that you can understand that in a lot of television debates, sometimes people take different political views and political stands, and there are so-called experts that have their respective political affiliations, and sometimes what they speak is out of a necessity because they have to take a political view of whichever political affiliation they belong to. So the actual global comparison of actual figures and actually where India stands is often not done in television debates. But if you go and search on the internet, you're going to find some really nice articles on Economic Times or Business Standard or Live Mint or The Wire or the Hindu websites where you're going to get some actual figures. Or you can directly go to the websites of World Bank or IMF or some other international websites, international publications as well, which provide you the actual figures. So it's always better to go and read articles that are published in these so-called publications that I mentioned, instead of relying on Indian TV debates. This is just my personal view, that a lot of the Indian television debates on economy and economic performance or socio-economic indicators and how they are interpreted is not very reliable in the last some time. So I would not suggest that. Instead, I would suggest going and reading in-depth articles based on these publications. There's another publication called Bloomberg, and Bloomberg Quint is there. Reuters, Reuters. These are some of the, so I can just write it down here, that some reputed publications to read economy related news and analysis are wire.in, Hindu group publications, Business Standard, ET, Live Mint, Scroll.in, then Reuters, Bloomberg, Quint, QZ. QZ is also a very nice international publication that covers India also fairly well. Then okay. Okay, yes. So as I said, so the same person, Dipanshu, is mentioning that it was Rajya Sabha TV where it was published that India is a consumption-based economy. India is actually not a consumption-based economy, as I mentioned, because compared to the developed countries and even compared to China, its consumption, that is its private consumption, annual private consumption as a percentage of GDP is lesser. See, again, let me explain to you. Compared to India's own performance in the last 20 years, India has moved on towards consumption more and more. And that is going to happen for any emerging economy as it moves towards becoming a developed economy. So yes, there are certain economists that say that India is now a consumption-led economy. There are no international rules or technical criteria which states that if so and so percentage is there, then so and so country is going to be called a consumption-led economy or an investment-led economy. There is no hard and fast criteria as such. But because India's percentage of private consumption is still far lesser compared to most of the developed world and compared to China as well, that is why, and even if we compare that to Brazil, even Brazil is a fast developing country, India's percentage is less. So that's why India is not per se called a consumption-led economy. Yes, there is a section of economists that promote India as a huge investment destination and they want to promote India's economy globally. That's why, and you must not forget, and this is something that goes without saying, that a lot of the television debates, and especially if the participants in those debates belong to the government, or they are representing the government, or they are representing a certain political affiliation where they have a certain belief, a set of beliefs or a set of political ideology to take, then of course they are going to promote in that manner. Again, as I said, there is no hard and fast definition. But globally, if you compare, you can say that compared to developed countries and China, India is still not exactly a consumption-led economy, but it is moving towards that. You can say that. Okay. So I was coming back to India's per capita income in PPP terms. Now, once again, here, as we discussed PPP earlier, so India's per capita income in PPP terms was US dollar 5,350. These are 2017 World Bank figures. I mean, basically, the figures were available later also in 2019 and 2020 on the World Bank. But in the World Bank tables, the latest figures are given for either 2017 or 2018. Even if you go to the World Bank website in the last few months, if you had gone, you would see that the figures that are given, the latest figures that are given in terms of tables, are only available for 2017. And maybe if they have updated it in the last 2-3 months, then probably it is 2018. And that's why, according to those 2017 or 2018 figures, India's per capita income in PPP terms is US dollar 5,350. That is the total gross national income of India divided by the total population of the country. And that's when we arrive at this figure. But this is in PPP terms. So what GDP figure are we going to divide? We are going to divide 9.5 trillion or whatever that PPP figure is by 1.4 billion. 1.4 or 1.4, sorry, 1.4 billion, yes. 9 trillion or whatever. So this is the figure. Again, since this is a slightly older figure, so at that time, India's per capita PPP GDP was around 8 trillion something in 17-18. So that's why this figure is 5,350 as per given in the World Bank. Because at that time when this figure was taken in 2017-18, India's PPP GDP was 8 to 8.1 trillion. But now India's GDP, of course, in 2019-20 was 9.5 trillion. So if you divide that figure by 1.4 billion, it's going to come somewhere around 6,000 something. So you can say it is between $5,500 to $6,000, depending on what is India's PPP GDP. You can just say that, or you can write it anywhere, that depending on what is the value of India's GDP in terms of purchasing power parity, and that also depends on the exchange rate, India's per capita income revolves around rupees $5,500 to US dollars 5,500 to US dollars 6,000, but it's somewhere around US dollar 6,000. It has not crossed that yet. So in rupees terms, this is a more clear figure, because of course there can always be confusion related to US dollar figure, but the country's per capita monthly income is estimated to have risen by 6.8% to rupees 11,254 per month during the financial year 2019-2020. That is in FY20. In financial year 2020, India's per capita monthly income, this is monthly figure. So if you just multiply it by 12, you're going to get the annual figure as well, which is going to be somewhere around 1,40,000 or something, 1,35,000 or 1,40,000, somewhere around that. It's going to be 1,35,000 per year in financial year 2020. By the way, there are strong chances that India's per capita income might actually fall in FY21 because a vast majority of the population has seen pay cuts and their incomes go down compared to financial year 2020. So let's move on to some other interesting facts about the Indian economy. But before we move on there, does anyone have any question? If anyone has a question, you can. Okay, so we will come to FDI figures. We will come to FDI figures soon as well, either in this session or in tomorrow's session, because I do not want to cover everything today. So maybe we will cover some of the aspects tomorrow. We will cover some aspects related to FDI today, but we will do a cross-country comparison tomorrow because otherwise too many figures will confuse you. So I am going to cover India FDI compared to other countries' FDI tomorrow, but we are going to cover India's own figures of FDI in different sectors and which are the major countries that invest in India today. By the way, you have to think in this manner. United States and Japan are highly developed countries. They are highly developed countries. They are consumption-led economies. So most of the technologies and most of the new products and services related to IT, software, manufacturing, they're actually produced there only. So they do not need that much FDI, that is some foreigner investing in those countries. Although they still have fairly high values of foreign investment or foreign direct investment, but they do not per se require any foreign investors to come and invest there. Yes, some companies like Japanese companies invest in the US, US companies invest in China, Chinese companies invest in US, Chinese companies invest in Japan. So in this three-way process goes on between the US, China, Japan, Germany, these 3-4-way process, cross-country investments. But India, because India's technological expertise and capital investment in developing technology, R&D is still fairly very low compared to advanced countries or even compared to China. I mean, United States spends nearly $550 billion on R&D, whereas China has come close to 500 billion. Japan is somewhere around 370, 380 billion. India still hasn't crossed 100 billion. It's slightly less than 100 billion. So that's why, just excuse me for a moment. Yes, my sincere apologies for this brief interruption. I hope all of you are there. So, are all of you there? Yes. So, yes. So I hope everyone else is there as well so that I can continue. Do you have any other questions based on what we have covered till now? Now, this section took a lot of time because I needed to explain some concepts and make you understand the simple logical connections. We are not going to go into details once again in PPP and exchange rates and how GDP is calculated or how investments and consumption and etc. is calculated and all that. We are not going to go into that. There are some technicalities which keep changing the actual values constantly. Yes, does anyone else has a question, or have a question rather? Okay, one person is asking, sir, was topics can be a detailed analysis of these terminologies too? Sorry, I did not get your question, what you're trying to ask. Was topics can be a detailed analysis of these terminologies too? If you could just elaborate on your question. Oh, okay. Yes. So a very good question one person has asked, that is a consumption-led economy better or an investment-led economy better? See, up till now, history of the world has been such that some of the most advanced life standards globally are in economies which are all consumption-led economies, where consumption is near 100% of GDP or sometimes even more. But the flip side to the same argument is that consumption, that is that huge amount of goods and services that are consumed by individuals, is based on methods of production and distribution which are environmentally and ecologically disastrous. So when they are environmentally and ecologically disastrous, this consumption led economic model has to be based on ecologically friendly and environmentally sustainable means of production and distribution. If they are not there, simple ways, whatever products, whatever goods, whatever services we are consuming, if the method of producing them, like for example, how a laptop is manufactured and distributed and it reaches the end consumer, how the entire energy in an economy, electrical power, fuel, all kinds of energy is produced, distributed, and consumed, how construction is done, how any other kinds of manufacturing is done. If it is based on environmentally and ecologically sustainable methods, which over a period of time reduce greenhouse gas emissions and reduce the carbon footprint, then yes, a consumption-led economy in the future is going to be sustainable. But otherwise, the major issue of global warming and climate change is evolving such that current models that are near universally there across the globe of how products and services are produced and consumed, they are not sustainable. Humanity as a whole will have to move to some other aspects. Okay. No. One person is asking that can WAT topics be based on analyzing economies based on these aspects like PPP? No. I am absolutely sure that the topics on WAT are going to be based on general facts and general knowledge. It is up to you if you can mention such analysis in terms of PPP, or in terms of investment-led economy or consumption-led economy, or in terms of median incomes, or in terms of per capita incomes. If you can mention such facts and figures, great. And you can logically connect them. But they are not going to ask you that you compare the economic growth or the economic model of two different countries based on PPP. They are never going to ask you that. Don't worry about it. Okay, one person is asking what is gig economy. Basically, gig economy simply means that when you do not have full-time salaried jobs where you get a fixed salary every month. Gig economy simply means a part-time contract-based jobs where you get paid on a per project or per assignment basis, or sometimes weekly basis or something like that. Or let's say you're doing a short-term project, so you have a contract that you're going to be paid so and so for so and so contract for so and so project. Once the project is complete, your gig is over, and then if you get another project from the same employer, great. Otherwise, you look for another gig or another project-based job somewhere else. That's what gig-based economy is. It simply means freelancing, you can say. Yeah. So one of the participants has very well termed the right word for it. You can say it's a freelance-based economy. So let's move on to other interesting facts about Indian economy, demography, etc. So as we are all well aware that every 10 years a census takes place. A census is conducted by the government of India, and right now a census is going on. Although because of the pandemic, the entire process of conducting the census is going very slowly, but the census is going on right now. So some of these figures here are based on the 2011 census, or some of these figures are based on extrapolations done by the government based on the census figures. That is, when the census was conducted in 2010-11, the government of India collected some data and facts. Then, based on economic models or based on demographic models or econometric models, they are extrapolating what will be the values at the end of different financial years or different calendar years. So these are those figures based on Government of India estimates, and they are fairly, usually these estimates are fairly accurate because they are done by some of the top economists in the Indian government. So India's total population is 1.35 billion. Actually, according to the latest estimates, it's close to 1.39 billion. This is somewhere you can say second half of 2020, somewhere around second half of 2020. That's what the estimates is. Then population growth rate in 2019 was 1.08%. That is annual average growth rate. So this is annual population growth rate, 1.06. So over the calendar year 2019, India's population grew by 1.08%. Then literacy. Now again, it is very difficult to measure literacy because literacy on a pan-India basis, that is across the country, literacy is measured only once every 10 years. That is when the census is held. So last time when the literacy rates were measured on a whole countrywide basis was in the 2011 census, and that time literacy rates were 74.04%, out of which males were 82.14% and 65.46% was the literacy rate for females. Now, this might seem to be a very nice figure that by now maybe it is 90% or something, but we must realize that the definition of literacy as per Indian government, the definition of literacy as is given in the census figures, in the census reports, or according to the Ministry of Education, literacy basically means that a person who's able to read basic simple words and alphabets and words in Hindi or in English, or if they are able to do very basic addition and subtraction, that's it. Very basic addition or basic subtraction, or they can do basic counting, then they are considered literate. If they can read some very basic simple words, they can write very basic simple words like their names or a few very basic words, they are considered literate. So this figure for literacy is very misleading when it comes to the level of knowledge or the level of education of a person. Even today, and I'm going to cover this fact perhaps tomorrow, that in 2018-19 or I think 17-18, a comprehensive all India survey of higher education was done, which was called the, I think, ASHA survey or something like that, All India Survey of Higher Education, ASHE. It was, I think, done in 2017-18 or 2018-19. And the figures are stated that even now in the adult population of India, just around 25% of the population has gone to college. Out of the total adult population of India at that time, only around 25% of the population of the country had actually gone to college. And that was only a figure of the people who had gone for higher education after 10+2 level among the adult population of the country. That is people who are 18 years and over. It was not the figure of the number of graduates or number of postgraduates. Number of graduates and number of postgraduates is much lower. It's probably around 10 or 11%. The total number of graduates in India out of the entire adult population, not even 10%, perhaps even less than that. It's probably around 6 or 7%. In fact, I was actually searching for those figures. That is the total number of college graduates in India among the adult population as a percentage. I could not get figures anywhere. There are no figures given anywhere on the internet. There's just some wide estimates given. There are no accurate figures in terms of what percentage of India's adult population has at least a bachelor degree, an undergraduate degree. There are no figures available anywhere. So India is far behind, because for the United States, let me tell you that out of the percentage of population which is 25 years and over, 38 to 40% people have a bachelor's degree, and more than 50% have a diploma, what is considered 2 years of college. That is the very clear available figures for the United States, that 38% or slightly over 38% adult population, and there they count it as 25 years and over. They do not take it from 18 years. They count these figures from all the population that is 25 years and above age. For that population, nearly 38 to 39% have bachelor's degrees. Whereas for India, I think that figure will probably not even be 10%. So that is a stark difference. So now we move on to the next figures. Again, life expectancy. Once again, currently it is considered that India's these are only estimates, that currently India's life expectancy would be around 71 to 72 years when the current census results are declared, probably this year. Sometime this year, the latest, or maybe second half of this year, the latest census results will be declared, and it is expected that India's life expectancy would be somewhere overall around above 70. Whereas right now, it is somewhere around 68 to 69, somewhere around that, taking men and women combined. So you can very well mention that based on the National Health Profile of 2019, based on 2012 to 2016 figures, the life expectancy is 67.4 years for men and 70.2 years for women. So you can say that is according to the National Health Profile that was published by the Government of India in 2019, which is based on the 2016 data. Till 2016, the data was collected and it was published in 2019. So this was the life expectancy for Indian males and females. Again, these figures can keep changing. This is just an estimate based on how better health facilities and better medication and better healthcare infrastructure is coming up. Again, if there are significant changes in the next few years, average life expectancy will go much higher. The only country in the world which has an average life expectancy for both males and females combined has, I think, just crossed 85, or maybe almost close to 85, is Japan. Japan has almost close to 85. And Japan also, by the way, has the highest number of centenarians in the world. At last count, it has around 72,000 centenarians. That is 72,000 people aged 100 or above, which is the highest anywhere in the world in terms of percentage. It has 72 or 73,000 people aged 100 or above. And it has nearly 10% of its population, which is aged 90 and above, which is a huge number, huge number. So India has 18 basically official languages, including Hindi and English, as per its as it is given in its official constitution as well. And then this is again based on census. These figures that what is the population in terms of their religious affiliation. Hinduism, Islam, Christianity, Sikhism, Buddhism, Jainism. You just, if you want, you can remember them. There's not much use for this. So let's move on to the other important figures, which are foreign exchange reserves. So India's foreign exchange reserves were $480 billion. So that's the exact figure, but you can round it off to $480 billion in March 2020. Of course, we can do latest figures as well, and we can find that out. So India's latest value, that I'm searching for a value that could be available for, let's say, December or January 2021. And yes, so I have received the latest value and we can do it here, which is $586 billion, January 2021. $586 billion, which consists of $541 billion of foreign exchange assets and $37.6 billion of gold reserves. So this is the latest value of foreign exchange reserves. So foreign exchange reserves in total consists of the different foreign currencies that are held by the Reserve Bank of India, and also the total value of gold reserves in terms of US dollar, again, that is held by India's Reserve Bank. This is all in US dollars. All this is in US dollar terminology. Okay. So this is India's total foreign exchange reserves. By the way, just to go back to history, a very interesting aspect, many of you would have read that in 1991, India's economic liberalization started, which is one of the major events in India's economic history. A lot of the sectors of the Indian economy were opened to private investment and foreign investment. Till 1990-1991, in most sectors of the Indian economy, there were licenses required. That is, if anyone wanted to open up a factory or a business in any sector, they first had to seek a license from the government of India. And it was a very, very cumbersome process which was replete with corruption, because it was basically called license Raj. So if you read a lot of economic newspapers and financial newspapers, you will come across this term license Raj a lot. That till 1990-1991, in every sector of the Indian economy, license Raj is there. So basically, yes, we were moving on to value of India's exports. So India's exports in April to November 2019 were US dollar 357 billion. Basically, US dollar 357 billion. Okay, so value of India's total exports was around 528 billion in FY20, or somewhere around, you can say 525 to 530 billion in FY20. This is the latest figures I just now checked. So before I move on, two of you have asked that does US have foreign exchange reserves? Yes, United States also has foreign exchange reserves. In fact, it around last few years, it has maintained foreign exchange reserves of roughly around 57 to 60. It has United States foreign reserves, which relate to the Chinese yen or the Japanese currency or the Russian currency or German or the euro, because United States also has to pay its different investors and its different foreigners that have invested in the US and they have their businesses running in the US. I mean, there are so many multi-billion-dollar businesses that are running in the US. So even the United States has to pay all the foreign investors and all the people who have invested in the United States through either through FDI or through its stock markets and all that. So United States also maintains healthy foreign exchange reserves in terms of somewhere around, sometimes it's $70 billion, sometimes it's $100 billion, but it's not very huge because United States does not need such high foreign exchange reserves because its own currency itself is the world's reserve currency. But I was just looking at these figures, and in January 2020, United States has foreign exchange reserves of just $129 billion. So let me write it here, since one of you asked, although this is not important. US had foreign exchange reserves of US dollar 129 billion in January 2020, which is much lower than India's, because as we have discussed, United States' own currency is the world's reserve currency. So they do not require to hold a lot of, foreign currencies. But still, because US has to make payments to a lot of different foreigners who have their businesses going on in terms of interest payments, in terms of whatever revenues are taken out by foreign companies that have invested, or in terms of other kinds of export related or import related, especially payments that are to be made. So that's why United States also often holds foreign currencies as well. So value of India's total exports was US dollars 525 to 530 billion in FY20. However, in FY21, it is expected to go down significantly. It might even go down all the way to $450 billion or something. Again, it will depend on what happens, how the economy pans out, how everything, because India's economy is expected to contract by 7.5 to 8%, or some people are saying even by 10%. So exports are going to take a hit. So they could go down all the way to 450, 460 billion as well for financial year 2021. So it will depend how things go. So crucial export partners of India, or rather I should say crucial export as well as import partners. But the reason I've written export is that these are the countries where India mostly exports. So these are US, UAE, China, Hong Kong, Singapore, UK, Bangladesh, etc. And we can also write here EU as a whole, but EU as a whole will become major, but otherwise it's very small if we consider individual countries of the European Union. So one of you is asking that what all does the foreign exchange assets comprise of? So as I explained that for most of the countries, the foreign exchange assets basically comprise of the foreign exchange assets mostly comprise of their reserves of different foreign currencies of different countries. Like, for example, India mostly holds currency in terms of the US dollar, but it also holds all the other different currencies as well, because so many different Indians are traveling to so many different countries all the time. So they need currency of all the different countries, but mostly it's US dollar, Euro, UK pound, Japanese yen, Chinese renminbi in Chinese. So all these are the currencies. Okay, one of you is asking if these are interim exports. No, these are the final figures. These are these are actually the final estimated figures for FY20, India's exports. These are the estimated figures of India's exports over the financial year 2020. These are not any interim figures. These are for the entire financial year 2020, which was April 1, 2019 to March 31, 2020. These are the final figures for India's total merchandise exports. Now, let me be clear. When we talk about exports, we are not talking about services exports here. We are only talking about exports of goods. That is some physical goods that are exported from India. This is that figure. Okay, let me just make a correction. In fact, it's a very good question that you asked. Let me just make a small correction. And I sincerely apologize. I made a minor error here. This combines both goods and services exports. As goods exports were US dollar 320 billion in FY 2019-20. Were services exports like IT services, etc. So India's total exports, which combines both goods as well as services exports, were US dollar 525 to US dollar 530 billion in FY20, out of which India's goods exports were US dollar 315 billion, roughly around 315 billion, and the remaining were services exports like IT services, etc. So now we move on to crucial exports partners of India, which we have already discussed. Now, although Hong Kong is a part of China, but it has a very special status within China. So Hong Kong is considered separately. In fact, even the World Bank, IMF, and all the international financial organizations also take into account Hong Kong's figures separately. And these figures are even published separately in all their reports and financial and economic documents. Although, because Hong Kong has a very special status, it is called Hong Kong SAR, Hong Kong Special Autonomous Region. So Hong Kong has a very special status within the Sovereign Republic of China. So in most of the international organizations and most of the other countries as well, they take into account Hong Kong's figures separately apart from China. Now we consider share of top investing countries. Now this is a very interesting figure because this takes into account almost the last 19 or so years. That is from April 2000 till June 2019, who are the top investing countries by FDI in India. So the number one country in terms of FDI is Mauritius, then Singapore, then UK, then Japan, then Netherlands, then USA, and then Germany. Now, why are Mauritius and Singapore the top two? This is a very good question. That Mauritius is a very small country. Even Singapore is relatively very small. So how come Mauritius and Singapore, contribute the largest FDI? Now, FDI basically means foreign direct investment. Foreign direct investment simply means that is when investment is done in actually opening up any new business in terms of any production or distribution or manufacturing or supply chain facility, and not in the stock markets of India. When an investment is made in directly in terms of opening a new business in India, it could be any kind of business, manufacturing, services, or it could be, let's say a company has acquired, some foreign company has acquired some major stake in an Indian company. That is also considered FDI. But if that investment is done through the stock market, then it is called FII, that is foreign institutional investment. FII, foreign institutional investment. But FDI is when directly in acquiring a business or opening up a new business or acquiring a major stake in actual different physical assets of a business are there, different assets of a business directly, that is called foreign direct investment. So now we come to the next very important aspect. So we were discussing how Mauritius and Singapore. So India has a tax avoidance treaty with Mauritius. So this is something very complicated, which I'm not going to go into detail, but many years ago, many decades ago, India signed a treaty with Mauritius, which is called the Tax Avoidance Treaty. It has a slightly technical name, not a very technical name, but slightly technical name. It's called the Tax Avoidance Treaty with Mauritius. Under this Tax Avoidance Treaty, a lot of the foreign companies, what they do is that they first set up companies in Mauritius, where what they have to do is they simply register their companies in Mauritius. They open some bank accounts and small offices. And through those companies, which are called shell companies, through those companies, a lot of investment by different foreign companies across the globe. So there could be companies from the US, companies from UK, Germany, Japan, and all across the globe. They invest in India through Mauritius. Now, why do they do that? Because India has a treaty with Mauritius, which states that if companies invest through Mauritius, then they do not have to pay taxes in India, because these major foreign companies or foreign firms are investing their money indirectly through those companies, through their subsidiary companies, which are registered in Mauritius. And since India has a tax avoidance treaty with Mauritius, that is why these companies first set up their subsidiary companies, which are often called shell companies, in places like Mauritius and Singapore, and then through that they invest in India. So it's mostly all the major players across Europe, US, Canada, Japan, and even in China, which invest in India through their subsidiary companies in Mauritius and Singapore, because India has tax avoidance treaties. So all these subsidiary companies of these major multinational companies that are there in Mauritius and Singapore, whatever incomes they earn in India, they do not have to pay taxes, because those incomes are earned by companies which are registered in Mauritius and Singapore, and India has a treaty that they are not going to charge any taxes on companies that are registered in Mauritius or Singapore. Again, this issue has been in a lot of at times in the news, because India's internal laws and internal administration and internal investment and business climate is considered not very suitable even today, which we are going to understand through a lot of rankings later on. So this is the reason why India is not a very favorable destination for investment by foreign firms. Unlike China, China has become a very, very favored destination over the last 20-25 years or so. So because India's internal politics and internal governance and administration is such that India was not able to directly have investments from these countries. So what they did was that India had to sign these treaties with Mauritius and Singapore, and said that any company, any firm, or any organization through these tax avoidance treaties are going to invest in India, and then those companies will not have to pay any taxes. So it is a win-win situation for the companies, because when the companies invest through their subsidiary companies which are registered in Mauritius and Singapore, they are not mandated by law to show anywhere what are their revenues, what are their net profits, and they are not supposed to pay any taxes. In this way, the companies are able to basically prevent on taxes both ways. They are able to save on taxes that they are to pay in their own country, and they are also able to save on taxes that they are supposed to pay in India. So at both places, let's say there is a company that is originally from Germany, and that company invests in India through its subsidiary in Mauritius. So in this way, they avoid paying taxes both in Germany as well as in India, or they have to pay very little taxes. So in that way, they save on taxes, and India gets the necessary foreign investment that it needs in terms of technology, in terms of modern knowledge, in terms of all the money that is needed to create new jobs and to have the economy going on. So it's a win-win situation for those companies as well as for India. Although yes, there are a lot of what should I say? There are a lot of controversies that have been there over the last few years related to these tax avoidance treaties, largely because a lot of Indian economists and experts say that, these companies do a lot of money laundering. That is India's black money that is generated by India's black economy, or all the firms, organizations, or individuals which generate a lot of unaccounted wealth. That is all the black money which is generated when no taxes are paid on certain revenues or profits, and then that money is basically channeled through these different tax destinations back into India, but never taxes are paid on it. And since taxes are not paid, so a lot of important investment that has to be made for underprivileged people in India, like for poor people in terms of education, healthcare, infrastructure, electricity, power, water, energy, and all food. These kind of investments lack because India is not able to collect sufficient revenues. Indian government is not able to collect sufficient revenues in terms of taxes to then invest for the poorest and the underprivileged sections of the population in India. So this is the whole crux of the matter, that a lot of economists and experts and even people who have their different political ideologies, they say that, India should move out of these tax avoidance treaties and instead have some other means so that a lot of this money laundering stops. Okay. So now one of you was asking why companies favored Argentina and Vietnam. Now, I'll be very honest, I'm not aware of this fact. So if you allow me some time, I'll probably go and read about this, because even I'm not aware. Maybe I've heard about it once or twice, but I also need to read on this fact, that why companies favored Argentina and Vietnam. Vietnam, I'm aware of that a lot of companies favor investing in Vietnam because Vietnam over the last 2.5 decades has gradually improved its domestic conditions, its internal governance and systems and law and order situation so well that a lot of manufacturing companies from Europe and US are investing in manufacturing facilities in Vietnam. Even a lot of the European and US companies have shifted their manufacturing operations from China to Vietnam, because Vietnam has significantly improved its internal domestic climate for investment and to setting up new businesses and new manufacturing plants and supply chains, etc. That's what I'm aware about Vietnam. I'm not so sure about Argentina, so I need to read upon that. Okay, so these are the major top countries by foreign direct investment, FDI, in India during this period, April 2000 to June 2019. That is, if the entire investment in FDI, considering these entire 20 years is done, then nearly 32% of all FDI in this 20 years was done by Mauritius, and nearly 20% of all the FDI in this nearly 20-year period was done by Singapore, or basically was done by companies that were registered in Singapore. So let's move ahead. External debt on India. Again, this was US dollar 557.4 billion as in March 2020. So you can very well say that US dollar 550 billion was India's external debt. Now, what is external debt? External debt means that basically any Indian company, organization, or state or central government in India, whatever debt in terms of loans and interest payments and principal amount that any Indian organization or individual that they owe to any, sorry, not individual, but any Indian organization, that is a company or a government owned company or a private company or a publicly listed company or the Indian government, central or state government, all of them put together, that they owe to other countries minus what the other countries owe to India. So that is the net of that. So net external debt on India is 550 billion, the rough figure you can take. So basically, whatever amount that at any point of time Indian organizations, Indian government, and all the state governments owe to foreign countries or foreign companies or foreign banks or whatever, World Bank, IMF, or other foreign financial institutions, minus whatever other countries or whatever the rest of the world owes to India. That net figure is the external debt on India. So this is a very largely a favorable figure. There's no big deal in this. There's no real alarms related to this figure. It's a sort of a healthy figure for India. There are no real alarms here. Now, gold reserves in India, this is just a figure in terms of as per Q4 quarter of 2019. This is just a figure in terms of weight. We've already discussed earlier that the value of gold reserves was basically US dollar 37.6 billion, which was in January. Latest figure was US dollar 542 billion or 540 billion of foreign exchange assets and US dollar 37.6 billion of gold reserves. This is actually the latest figure. So you can probably even just not forget this figure. This is not important, not as such important. So you can just forget this figure. Now, this is the per capita GDP in India. This is the nominal value. And this is the 2019 nominal value. If you remember, the earlier value that we considered was the PPP figure. This is the per capita GDP in India. Per capita nominal GDP. India's per capita nominal GDP as per IMF 2019 figure. So earlier, if you go upstairs, just go a little above, we see that India's per capita income in PPP terms was US dollar 5,350, close to US dollar 5,350. This is PPP figure. And this one, which is the 2019 figure, in fact, this is the latest figure. This is a later figure, India's GDP per capita, which is the 2019 figure according to the International Monetary Fund, that is the IMF. it is US dollar 2,171. So you can see that if we kind of multiply this by 3, if we multiply this 2019 figure by around 3 is the PPP exchange factor, we are going to get somewhere around 6,500 something. And I told you that the earlier figure was for 2017, and the later figure of India's per capita PPP GDP is 6,500. I earlier told you that figure of 5,350 was based on the exchange rate in 2017. But because the exchange rate has also been, going the other way, that is gradually the exchange rate has risen from 69.70 to 73.74. And India's incomes per household or per capita and GDP per capita has also risen in those 2 years. So counting both these factors into account, now India's per capita PPP GDP will be somewhere around US dollar 6,500. So maybe we can just change this figure and write it here, that this is somewhere around 6,000, let's say 300 to dollar 6,500 based on IMF 2019 figures, somewhere around that. Okay, this is the final figure that we arrive at. So let's quickly move on further. And now we move on some of the popular rankings of India in different. So here you just have to remember that what are India's rankings in different categories. So this is basically the name of the ranking, and what is India's rank, who has published that ranking, and which country holds the top position in that same ranking. So there is this ranking which is called International Intellectual Property Index 2020, where India's rank was 40. That is for 2020 figures. That is the latest ones, which is published by US Chamber of Commerce. Now, US Chamber of Commerce is a very important industry body in the US, which is represented by hundreds of top companies and businesses in the US. And they come up with their annual reports and rankings globally of different countries, like which countries are to what extent favorable for further investment. So India's rank in terms of intellectual property, that is to what extent India's internal rules, laws, and regulations are good enough for protecting all kinds of intellectual property, that is all kinds of patent and copyright protections, copyright protections for different hardware, software, process patents, etc. India's rank was 60 in the latest rankings, which were there of 2020. So then we come to the World Competitiveness Index 2020. India's rank was 43. And this is published by the Institute of Management Development in, and I think this Institute of Management Development, I'll have to check where exactly this is. Institute of Management Development, let me just check where this is. So this is basically an institute based out of Singapore only, and its top positioned country is also Singapore. It is called IMD in short, often Institute of Management Development. And according to its World Competitiveness Index 2020 ranking, India's rank was 43, while the top position was held by Singapore. That is basically, this ranking takes care of how competitive is a country in terms of its business climate, investment climate. That is, different sectors as a whole, different industrial sectors or different business sectors as a whole of a country's economy, how competitive they are. That is, if let's say a foreign investor or a foreign company wants to invest in India, then which sectors should they look at? Or overall, where India stands vis-a-vis other countries. So India's rank was 43. Global Innovation Index. Again, this is a very, very important organization, World Intellectual Property Organization, WIPO, World Intellectual Property Organization. This is a very, very important organization that basically sets rules, regulations, and standards. Basically, this organization keeps coming up with new standards and metrics, and basically it comes up with new formulae and a new set of benchmarks to how to manage, protect, and compare intellectual property rights and intellectual property laws, rules, and regulations across the globe. World Intellectual Property Organization. So India's rank in 2020 index released by this organization WIPO was 48, and the top position was Switzerland. So Switzerland, and in fact in some other rankings as well, Switzerland is basically nowadays among the top 2 or the top ranked country in the world. So we move ahead to Democracy Index 2019, again a very, very important index. This is released by Economist Intelligence Unit. Now, what is the Economist Intelligence Unit? The Economist Intelligence Unit, EIU, is a very important part of the Economist group. Economist is one of the world's most respected and widely read magazines. It is published from the UK, and it is basically related to analyzing economic, political, and business aspects of different countries. It's a news magazine. It's a news and analysis magazine. It has been published for many decades now, and it has a very significant research part of it, which is called Economist Intelligence Unit. Quite often it is called, in short, EIU. And Economist Intelligence Unit comes out with its annual index called Democracy Index, where it analyzes how strong a democracy is in a particular country. So India was ranked 51 according to the latest figures, which were for 2019. 2019 are the latest rankings available, and Economist Intelligence Unit rated India at 51 here. And Norway is the #1 ranked country here. Norway is basically the #1 ranked country here. In fact, you are going to come across a lot of these countries which are in Northern Europe, like Norway, Denmark, Netherlands, Switzerland, Finland, Sweden. These countries ranked among the top countries in most governance, business, and in terms of development rankings at most places. So now we come to World Talent Index 2020. World Talent Index is released by INSEAD. INSEAD is a very, very famous business school, one of the world's top business schools in the world, which is called INSEAD. It is based in Switzerland. It has some other campuses as well. So INSEAD annually releases its World Talent Index 2020 ranking. India was ranked 59, while Switzerland was ranked #1. Sorry, I made a small mistake. INSEAD is basically based out of France. INSEAD is one of the world's top business schools, a highly reputed business school, one of the top in the world. It is based out of France. Now it has campuses at other places as well. So it ranked Switzerland as the world's top country in terms of the World Talent Index 2020, while India was ranked 59. Ease of doing business, a very, very important ranking. This is a very, very important ranking. Ease of doing business 2019 ranking released by the World Bank. India was ranked 63rd, while New Zealand was ranked #1. A very, very important ranking. Again, this is very important as well. Then we come to Energy Transition Index 2020, given by WEF. WEF is the World Economic Forum. And here, India was ranked 74th, while Sweden was the #1 ranked country. Basically, the Energy Transition Index calculates how good a country is doing in terms of making its entire energy system more and more sustainable, more and more green, more and more environment and ecologically friendly and more efficient. So it has its own set of variables on the basis of which it measures the performance of how the entire energy system in a particular country is transitioning from very heavy ecologically or environmentally polluting industries to sustainable and efficient and basically cost saving as well as environmentally friendly energy sources. So India was ranked 74 in the latest Energy Transition Index 2020 ranking, while Sweden was ranked number 1. So as I mentioned, most of these countries, Sweden, Norway, Finland, Denmark, Netherlands, Switzerland, they are going to be among the top in a lot of these rankings, and New Zealand as well. Then we come to another very important ranking, which is the Global Hunger Index. I've discussed this earlier as well in one or two previous sessions. Global Hunger Index is basically published by an organization in Europe called Concerned Worldwide and Welthunger Hilfe. So these two organizations together publish the Global Hunger Index annually, and India in the 2020 index was ranked, this is again 2020, was ranked 94 out of I think 117 or something, 120 countries or something. So India's rank was not good. So hunger even today, sustained hunger or chronic hunger. Chronic hunger means that when a person goes hungry for a significant period in a week or in a month and they are not able to have proper meals in a day. So India's vast majority, not vast majority, but a significant percentage of India's population still suffers from chronic hunger or malnourishment, which is a very serious concern. So these are the organizations that publish it, and Belarus was ranked the highest. Belarus is one of the former, you can say, countries that was very close to the Soviet Union, and which was the former country from which Russia and many other countries came out. So Belarus is also in Eastern Europe, and it is ranked number 1 in this. Now we come to Global Competitiveness Index, again a very index, particularly for people who are going for MBAs and people who are interested in business analysis and economic analysis. That according to the Global Competitiveness Index 2019 ranking, that's the latest ranking that is available, India is ranked 72. Once again, this is given by the World Economic Forum, a very important organization. And according to this ranking as well, Switzerland was ranked the top country in terms of being most competitive economy wise. That is, Swiss economy is the world's most competitive economy. That is, its industries and its different organizations, different businesses are the most competitive in the world. So India was ranked 72. Now we come to Corruption Perception Index, again a very important index, because Transparency International is a very well-known organization for the last nearly 50 years that is publishing these annual rankings called Corruption Perception Index. And India's ranking, as we can all very well gauge, that corruption remains a major issue in India's public life and in India's governance and administration. So according to the Corruption Perception Index 2020 ranking, India's ranking was 80. And this again was topped by two countries that I've spoken of earlier from that same list, Denmark and New Zealand, which are the least corrupt countries in the world and are ranked number 1, according to the latest Transparency International's Corruption Perception Index. Then we come to the Global Gender Gap Index. This is again published by the WEF. India is ranked 112, which is, to be honest, a very hopeless ranking. India, in terms of reducing the gender gap, that is in terms of providing equal opportunities and allowing women to enjoy equal rights, India has a long way to go in that. India is ranked 112, whereas the number 1 ranked country is Iceland. And I think if I remember correctly, either one of Finland or Norway or something is ranked, Finland or Norway or Switzerland, one of these 2-3 countries is ranked number 2 in this ranking. The Global Gender Gap Index. I think Finland is probably ranked number 2 here. Then we come to World Press Freedom Index. Now, this is a ranking where India has done fairly badly in the last few years. India's ranking has been going down in the World Press Freedom Index 2020. It is published by a very reputed organization called Reporters Without Borders. Reporters Without Borders is an organization that originally started in Europe. And this is basically a global organization of journalists and reporters across the world. And they publish this annual ranking, annual index and a report. There's a report and then there is an index in that report, and there is a ranking based on that index, which is called the World Press Freedom Index. And its 2020 edition had India's rank as 142, which is a very dismal ranking, because for journalists and reporters, India has not been a very favorable and handy place in the last some time, and its ranking has been going down. Again, a lot of sections of Indian media and in the Indian government says that this is not a very accurate ranking, and the methodology and the data collection and the facts on which this is based are highly, basically they can be doubted, and there are some suspicions related to that. So there has been a fair level of controversy related to this ranking as well. Then we come to Human Capital Index. Before I come to the second last one, first go to the Human Capital Index, which is again given by the World Bank, where again, how educated, how healthy, and how talented and skilled a country's population is again measured by the World Bank's Human Capital Index. And according to the 2020 edition of that index, Human Capital Index, India was ranked again a fairly low 116, while Singapore was the #1 ranked country according to this. Singapore was the highest ranked country according to these figures. Now we come to this particular, and why I wanted to mention this at the end. This Environmental Performance Index, which is also often called EPI, it is a biannual index, that is once every 2 years. That is in 2016 to, I think, first it was, this is a very recent index. It was not even published earlier. Two of the top universities in the world, Yale University and Columbia University, both are based in US. They together have a dedicated research center on environment, and they have a dedicated team of scientists and researchers who are from outside, as well as some of them are the professors of these universities only. They have come together, and every 2 years they release this Environmental Performance Index. They have a dedicated website also, so you can just search on Google and go to this index. This is, I think, the world's most respected and comprehensive index or comprehensive measure of how a country is performing in terms of protecting, conserving, and sustaining its environment, its forests and wildlife, its coastal systems, its marine water bodies, its sustainable agriculture, how water and energy is used sustainably, all these aspects, how it is managed, tackling global warming and climate change, how it is reducing pollution gradually. All these factors are considered. And in the 2018 index, let me tell you about the 2018 index. India was actually ranked last, I think last or second last in that ranking. India's rank was 177 or something, if I remember correctly, or 178. I don't remember exactly, but India was in the 170s, and it was probably the last or the second last country in that ranking. It has only marginally improved to 168. So you can very well imagine that India, when it comes to its model of development, like the kind of energy production, energy distribution, and energy use, and in terms of all the practices in manufacturing, transportation, producing energy, all kinds of methods, technologies, practices, and the economic model that is there in India, it is hopeless, to be honest. Let me say, it is very bad. India needs to work significantly to improve its environmental laws, rules, regulations, norms, and how all these are implemented effectively by different governments and different local bodies, so that all kinds of industries and businesses do not continue to severely harm India's environment and ecology. So India has a huge challenge when it comes to tackling local and regional pollution, when it comes to tackling destruction to its forests, wildlife, biodiversity, and in terms of managing and tackling the gradually growing effects of global warming and linked climate change. So now we come to the last, some important aspects, which is, and for US, the services, I'll just catch this figure. Let me just catch this figure before we come further. So yes. So as we discuss some aspects about world economy, and you can actually go to this link that is given here if you want to read a little bit more about the top economies in the world. So as per US government's calendar year 2019 figures, US government's financial year runs from October 1 to September 30, 2020. But the United States also publishes figures for calendar year as well. So it has a financial year that runs from October 1 to September 30 of the next year, but it also publishes figures for calendar year purpose as well. So US had a GDP of 21.7 trillion in the calendar year 2019, and it was the world's largest economy in nominal terms. Now, since every other country's GDP is compared to the US when we take into account the purchasing power parity concept, so US has the same figure for both nominal as well as PPP, because every other country's GDP and cost of is compared to that of the US dollar. So US has the same figure when it comes to nominal terms or PPP terms, which is 27.7 trillion for 2019. In PPP terms, it was the second largest because China was the largest. So as per World Bank figures taken in December 2020, in calendar year 2019, China was the second largest economy with GDP at US dollar 14.3 trillion in nominal terms and largest in PPP terms at US dollar 23.5 trillion. So this is a very, very important figure. That China was the second largest economy with GDP at US dollar 14.3 trillion in nominal terms, while largest in PPP terms. So if we consider the cost of living and then bring in the PPP terminology, then China is actually producing more goods and services right now compared to the US. China is actually the largest economy in the world. However, again, some economists have doubts about these figures. They also say that the Chinese government does not release the actual figures often, and they quite often fabricate or hide figures, and they release some exaggerated figures often. Again, we don't know what the truth is, but that's what some experts from different organizations say. But whatever the World Bank or the IMF figures are officially released on their websites or in their reports, we have to go by them. So China's GDP in terms of nominal means direct, taking into account the direct current exchange rate. It is US dollar 14.3 trillion in the calendar year 2019, while it was US dollar 23.5 trillion when we take into account purchasing power parity factor. So again, based on World Bank figures in December 2020, Japan and Germany were the third and the fourth largest in nominal terms, and they were fourth and fifth largest in PPP terms, because India becomes third largest in PPP terms. So if we take nominal exchange rate into account, then Japan is the third and Germany is the fourth largest with these are the figures. But when we take into account PPP terms, India becomes the third largest, as we have discussed earlier. And so Japan and Germany become the fourth and the fifth largest economies in PPP terms. So with this, we end today's session. Okay, one or two more points. That for United States, services contributed over 68% to the GDP. Industry contributed nearly 30%, while agriculture contributed just about 2%. So as I was discussing in the first half, in the very early quarter of this particular session, that in any advanced economy, services forms a major contributor to the GDP, and then high technology manufacturing comes next. High technology or medium technology manufacturing is also significant. but agriculture is very small. So like in the US, agriculture, and for a lot of other developed countries as well, agriculture hovers around 2% or at max 3% or something like that. For China, it is fast growing as well. And for China, industry contributes 40% of GDP, because as all of you, I'm sure, are already aware that the world's largest manufacturer in terms of US dollar value is China. China alone manufactures nearly 10 trillion US dollars worth of manufacturing produce when we take into account PPP terms. When we take into account the PPP factors, I'm not going to go into these figures. You don't need to remember that. It's very confusing. But if you want, you can go and search, but I'm not going to go into those figures. You can just say that nearly 40% of China's GDP is contributed by industry. But manufacturing alone contributes nearly 27.5%. So you can imagine, China has an economy of 14 point something trillion in nominal terms, and it contributes nearly that. So China has a US dollar 3.9 trillion, US dollar 3.9 trillion worth of manufacturing output in 2019, which is huge. You can imagine this. I mean, this is larger than the economy of India. This is actually much larger than the economy of India. China's manufacturing alone is much larger than the economy of India. This is the reason why China has fairly low unemployment rates, because China is able to provide millions and millions of manufacturing jobs to its people, and it has been doing so for the last nearly 20 years. And agriculture contributed 7%. So you can see China is also moving in the same direction, where gradually agriculture is contributing less and less to its GDP, and the remaining is services. So around, as you can see, 65% is services for China as well. Now, we end here today because we have discussed some important major aspects about India's economy, India's demography, and done a bit of comparison with other countries in terms of rankings and in terms of other major economic figures and indicators. So does anyone have any question or questions or comments or anything? You're most welcome. Yes, does anyone have a question or any comment or anything? No one has any question. Well, that honestly means two aspects: that either you were able to understand and learn everything, and your analysis was even better than mine, perhaps, or maybe you probably were not able to understand a lot of things and you are confused a bit. So, there is anything, any comments you want to share with me? Okay, so one of you is asking if we are supposed to learn these indices. If yes, will they be helpful? No. See, whatever you are comfortable in learning, I would suggest that at least have a clear idea what is India's GDP in terms of nominal and PPP terms. What is PPP? Just go and read the definition of PPP on your own. Comfortably, you will understand. It's not complicated. I have already explained in simple terms. You can watch this video again. What is the meaning of PPP? Again, what is the value of US economy in terms of GDP? What is the value of China's GDP? These are the three countries you can remember. Then you can remember what is the percentage of the different major sectors of India's economy. How much does services contribute? How much does industry contribute? How much does agriculture contribute? And within industry, how much does manufacturing contribute? Because agriculture is composed of, industry is composed of three things, which are manufacturing, mining, and construction. So you can remember that. Okay. Let me just go back to foreign direct investment. Some of you are asking certain questions. So let me just go back to those questions before I move further. Okay. So essentially, one of you is asking that what is the difference between the World Competitiveness Index and the Global Competitiveness Index? Okay. Actually, they are the names of two separate indexes that are published as part of reports and as rankings by two separate institutions. Global Competitiveness Index, as you can see, is published by WEF, World Economic Forum, which is a very important and significant global organization, especially related to business and industry. And then World Competitiveness Index is published by Institute of Management Development, IMD. This one is not such a popular one, so that's why, and not such a world recognized one, so that's why I've not put it in bold. This is not that important. But the Global Competitiveness Index, which I put it in bold, which is published by the WEF, World Economic Forum, is very important. So that's why sometimes very commonly sounding names of different rankings and indexes, they are actually published by different organizations. So that's why the difference is there. So now one of you is asking, please explain point number 2, which is India became third in number. Okay, let me go back. India became third in number. Okay, which point are you asking? I'm just, where exactly? Oh, okay. I believe you're asking here. Yes. So as we had discussed earlier in the earlier part of the session today, that when we consider the concept of purchasing power parity, that is the factor based on which the cost of living of a standard set of goods and services across different countries is taken, then we realize that the average cost of, let's say, a fixed set, let's say there are 20 different goods and services. Now that set of 20 goods and services is standard across the world. Now for that set of 20 goods and services, the average cost in US is taken and the average cost in India is taken over a period of 1 year in any particular financial year or any particular calendar year. Now it is compared. So we realize that in the United States, the annual expenditure or the annual cost of that set of goods and services over a period of 1 year is 3 times or little more over 3 times compared to India's, because that's the way US economy has developed. It has much higher incomes per household, per capita. So accordingly, pricing in itself is a huge thing in economics, how pricing of different goods and services is done in different economies. So pricing in itself is a whole area in economics. So accordingly, how pricing is done based on income levels in different countries, like you will be surprised to know that there are certain things that cost more in India compared to even the US, even despite the fact we take purchasing power parity into account. They are slightly more expensive in India. Like fuel is still quite expensive in India. Even compared to the US, it's almost close to the US value, even if we take into account purchasing power parity. So fuel, electricity charges are fairly high in India. Electricity tariffs in a lot of states, they are fairly high in India. So based on purchasing power parity, if we take that factor into account, then India's GDP becomes number 3 in the world, after China, which is number 1, and US, which is number 2. But if we take into account simply the fact that what is the exchange rate of the US dollar versus India's currency or versus China's currency, then US is the number 1 economy in the world, and China is number 2, Japan is number 3, Germany is number 4, and India is somewhere around 5th, 6th, or 7th, depending on what happens at the end of this financial year. But we have to be very clear about this, that in terms of PPP, India is the 3rd largest economy in the world, purchasing power parity. So, okay, now one of you was asking, can you once again explain FDI? So basically, foreign direct investment, it simply means that when any person or group or any company or organization is investing in a controlling stake in another business. That is, let's say, an individual who has a lot of money, or a group of individuals. They perhaps form a company or a fund or something. Or let's say there is an already existing company or firm in some other country, and they invest in India, and they set up a company in India, and under that company, they set up a plant, a manufacturing plant or a supply chain business, or any kind of online services business, or a mix of online services as well as physical business, and all that where has different assets. So if that company or that group or that individual has controlling stake in that business, or a certain amount of stake in that business, that is called FDI. Another form of investment is where any individual or group or organization, it could be a company or it could be any foreign government or any foreign fund, they actually invest in buying a company's shares or a company's bonds in the Indian bond market or the share market. That is called the foreign portfolio investment, FPI, or foreign institutional investment. So one of you was asking earlier, what is FPI? So foreign portfolio investment or foreign institutional investment almost mean the same thing. There's not much of a difference in that. Basically, when you invest in the stock markets or bond markets or capital markets or securities markets in a country's economy, and you do not directly invest in setting up a business, or do not directly invest in buying assets. So when you invest in buying shares or in buying bonds of a company, then you are buying that shares and indirectly you have some stake in that company. But when you directly buy assets, that is, you set up a manufacturing plant, or you acquire an existing manufacturing plant from some another company, or you acquire, let's say, warehouses and software and offices and manufacturing plants and vehicles and all kinds of physical assets that any business or company or group of companies has in India, and some foreign company or foreign group acquires it, that is called foreign direct investment. Because you are not investing in shares, you are not investing in bonds, you are actually investing in buying physical assets or actual assets of a business. It could be software assets as well. So that is called foreign direct investment. So now one of you is asking, agricultural contributions to the US GDP are so less, so that means US is importing agricultural goods. No, this is very complicated because this is related to import and export of different commodities, and world trade is a very complicated thing in itself. It will be very difficult to explain it. There are certain types of raw commodities or semi-finished commodities or entirely finished and packaged food commodities that United States imports because it felt that it did not have a competitive advantage in those particular food commodities. They could be raw fruits, raw grains, raw vegetables, raw dairy products, or they could be semi-finished, semi-prepared, or they could be entirely finished and packaged end products or branded products. And then there are certain food and related products that United States also exports. It's not like United States has a very low contribution of its agriculture to its GDP, not because its agricultural output is low. That is because the output in terms of dollar value of its services and manufacturing is much, much high. Its industry as well as its in services sector's contribution to GDP in terms of dollar value is very, very high. That is why the percentage value of agriculture's contribution is low. Okay. If you think that United States GDP is $21.5 trillion, so 2% of that would be around 45 billion. 45 billion would be the total value of US agriculture output. Now, India's agriculture output is not much higher than that. India's agriculture output is around 16% of India's GDP, which comes out to somewhere around, again, 45 billion only. If you take into account India's GDP is 2.7 trillion or something. So 27 trillion is 1%. So slightly higher, not exactly the same, slightly higher. In US GDP would be, sorry, I made a small error. If we do some rough calculations, and I'm doing that in my mind, United States, 1% of GDP would be roughly around $210 billion. So 2% would be somewhere around $400 billion. $400 billion is the total United States agricultural GDP. Whereas in India, if we take into account 16%, that would be somewhere around also $400 to $410 billion. So if you see United States GDP of agriculture in terms of dollar value is also around $400 billion. And India's agricultural GDP in terms of US dollars is also somewhere around slightly higher than US, which is around 420 or something GDP, $420 or something. But US has much lesser number of farmers compared to India. The number of people dependent on farming or in farm and agricultural production are much less. May at best maybe 2% of what India is. So you can imagine that agricultural productivity in US is much higher than the agricultural productivity in India. So again, we are going into too much technical details, and maybe you can go back to this video and learn all this, but I would suggest that just remember some important facts and figures. And if you want to learn a little bit more so that you can, perhaps if such questions come, you can answer effectively, then you can go back and watch the entire video. I would always recommend that you go back and watch the entire video once so that all these concepts are clear to you. Any other questions does anyone have? Okay, one of you had asked, by the way, before I end the session, that whether Bangladesh has a higher. So there was a controversy some months ago that Bangladesh had crossed. No, Bangladesh's per capita income is slightly lower than India's, not very low, but Bangladesh's GDP is not even 10% that of India's. It's around 8% or something, 8 or 9%, Bangladesh's total GDP. But Bangladesh's per capita income or per capita GDP is around 80% that of India's, 80% or something. So yes, in terms of per capita income or per capita GDP, it's not very far behind India. But of course, in terms of total GDP, India's population is much higher. So India's GDP is nearly 15 times or maybe around 12 or 12 times, not 15 times, around 12 times that of Bangladesh. It's something not very relevant. Yes, does anyone have any other question? Okay, so with this, I end this session. I hope you enjoyed today's session. Does anyone have any comments, any suggestions, how we can improve? Maybe I can improve as an instructor in these sessions. If there are any feedback, I'm most welcome to it. Any feedback from anyone? Yes, anyone wants to provide any feedback, any sincere, honest feedback?